Stories that time forgot.
Imagine a man in an impeccable suit handing you a gold pen to sign a document promising roads and hospitals, but which actually contains fine print designed to keep your grandchildren paying off a debt they never requested. The World Bank contract that mortgaged Africa's future. Washington, D.C., 1982. What you are about to discover in the next few minutes is not just a bureaucratic agreement, but the chronicle of how a lending system was transformed into an invisible noose that strangled the development of an entire continent. Stay until the end, because what you will learn today will forever change how you understand the architecture of invisible power. Section of this channel revealing that the frontiers of modern slavery are not drawn with walls, but with financial balance sheets impossible to level. Imagine you are there, in a climate-controlled boardroom where the air is so dry it irritates your throat. You are the finance minister of a newly independent African nation, and before you sit the emissaries of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The smell of new leather briefcases and the subtle cologne of diplomats fill the room. Outside, your country faces a brutal debt crisis due to soaring oil prices. Have you ever wondered why nations rich in diamonds, gold, and oil remain mired in absolute poverty? The answer lies in structural adjustment. Programs a series of draconian conditions that forced countries to sell off their natural resources at rock-bottom prices and cut healthcare and education just to pay the interest on the interest of an infinite foreign debt. As we have already discovered in other cases within the Architecture of Invisible Power section here at Stories Time Forgot, systemic design is the most effective tool of geopolitical control. These contracts were not simple development aid loans. They were disguised treaties for the surrender of sovereignty. They found that, under the guise of modernization, the privatization of basic services was demanded, allowing foreign corporations to seize the water and electricity of millions of people. Every signature on those papers was a sentence of stagnation for future generations, who watched as their land as wealth flew toward the financial hubs of New York and London through the international financial messaging system. While investigating alongside the dissident economists of the era, you realize the system was designed so the debtor could never settle the account. The atmosphere in African capitals turns tense, with strikes and protests silenced by governments that must obey Washington before their own citizens. The protagonist of this story is the contract itself, a document hundreds of pages long, written in nearly indecipherable technical language, that hid the trap of variable interest rates. The first act of this economic tragedy ends when the World Bank declares these adjustments the only path to progress, while infant mortality rates begin to climb due to a lack of public investment. But what comes next is even darker, because you will discover that this mechanism was used to install a technological and economic dependency that remains difficult to break today. How would you react if you knew that the money your country returns every year in debt payments is 5 times higher than what it spends on healthcare for its population? The second act takes us to the Treasury offices in the 90s, when the disaster is already evident. The pressure is immense. International organizations begin to denounce Africa's debt as unpayable and morally illegitimate. They start to notice that countries trying to go off script suffer immediate financial blockades. The sensory atmosphere becomes one of bureaucratic helplessness. It is the contrast between the opulence of banking headquarters and the reality of villages without access to basic medicine because the national budget must be earmarked to satisfy foreign banks. At this point in the story, the suspense is absolute. Investigators discover that many of these loans were handed to corrupt dictators, knowing full well the money would never reach the people, but ensuring the entire country was responsible for paying it back. The paradox is that international aid became the largest wealth extraction mechanism in modern history. This technique of using perpetual debt to control strategic resources is the same one we will see in our next episode, when we analyze the UN resolution that silently sold off the oceans, proving that when power signs a global agreement, there is always a hidden price that someone else will have to pay. The third act is the moment of supposed cancellation. In the face of global scandal, the World Bank and the G7 launch initiatives to forgive part of the debt, but they do so with new conditions that deepen control over mineral resources. The sound of applause at international summits masks the noise of excavators continuing to extract cobalt and lithium under 99-year exploitation contracts. The day after the grand announcements of charity, the reality remains the same, a financial structure that prevents the value of raw materials from staying where they are produced. However, the end of this story carries a warning for the present. Although some African nations have managed to renegotiate their terms, the shadow of debt remains the primary obstacle to their true sovereignty. The 1982 World Bank contract laid the foundation for an order where capital has more rights than human beings. They managed to prove that you don't need a military invasion to conquer a territory. A well-designed loan, a compliant accountant, and a contract that no one dares to question are enough. Before we finish, I must tell you that the next case we will unearth in this Architecture of Invisible Power section is equally shocking. The UN resolution that silently sold the oceans. We will see how a technical document carved up the ownership of the seabed and its hidden treasures among a handful of powers, leaving the rest of the planet watching from the shore. You can't miss it if you want to understand who truly owns what seems to have no owner. Now that you know the story of how the future of 1 billion people was mortgaged with a simple pen and paper, I ask you, do you believe the foreign debt of developing nations is a legitimate financial obligation, or is it a political tool that should be canceled to allow for a fairer world? Leave me your thoughts in the comments because your perspective is essential to completing this puzzle of history. Subscribe so the system notifies you when we unearth the next piece of the puzzle on Stories Time Forgot. Your support is what allows us to keep investigating these truths that power tried to erase forever. See you in the next section of our Library of Secrets.